Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. Well, I'm super excited for today's episode. As most of our viewers know, I'm a huge book fan, and for good reason, because there's great authors out there. And tonight, we have one of them joining us on RegWatch is Jacob Grier. Jacob, thanks for joining us today on RegWatch.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Brent.
Oh, no, you bet. No, our pleasure for sure. So we've got an in-depth conversation coming up about the war on vaping. But it's not just about vaping. Jacob's got a new book that was just out, published on September 18th. Fantastic. I mean, it's like hot off the presses. The book is titled, and let me just get to there for everyone. Oh, wrong one. Hold on. There we go. The book is titled The Rediscovery of Tobacco, Smoking, Vaping, and the Creative Destruction of the Cigarette. And it's got the historical motivations behind the anti-smoking crusade, the moral impulse that's driving the current panic over vaping. It covers it all. And really, the big thing is, how did things get so bad for vaping so quickly? And Jacob, that is the big question. And let's just, 1 second there, my friend. And that is the big question, Jacob. So what is the answer?
It's a complicated answer, but I would say the most important thing to think about is that the response to vaping is not a new thing. It's a movement that's been building for decades with how health authorities view smoking and tobacco use. And that's been ignored for a long time, but now that vaping has suddenly become very popular, it's important to look back on the history of the anti-smoking movement and understand why they respond to the use of nicotine in the ways that they do, and how that might skew our reporting and the science that we hear about it.
Now, how long did you work on writing this book?
Quite a long time, in part because I didn't have an editor or any deadlines, which allowed me to procrastinate quite a bit. But the timing ended up working out very well. The genesis for this was an article I wrote back in 2012 for The Atlantic. And that article obviously had less to do with vaping back then, because that was just starting to come to the fore. But it was called The Case Against a Smoke-Free America.
Oh. Sorry, Jacob. Just 1 second there. I'm playing with buttons here. Yeah, you were saying, sorry, it was, go back to the article, please.
Yeah, the article was called The Case Against a Smoke-Free America, which actually appeared in the health section of The Atlantic, which was a controversial decision, and a lot of people hated the piece, a lot of people really liked it. But I talked about what the threats were, not to the cigarettes so much, but to the quality side of the tobacco market, which is what was interesting to me as an occasional pipe or cigar smoker. So the article was about smoking bans, taxes, and FDA regulation, and what we might see in the next decade or so about how those might threaten the future of cigars and pipes.
And this was in 2012?
In 2012, right. And so that became the genesis for the book. And I had an agent, actually, who contacted me about writing it. And we put together a proposal, and the feedback we got from just about every editor who looked at it was that they really liked the writing, they really liked how contrarian the book was, but they just didn't think there were enough smokers left to justify publishing the book. They thought, who would be interested in this? And, as we'll talk about soon, most people's view of smokers is fairly low anyway, so they didn't see them as the type of people who would be purchasing a public policy book.
So that's actually quite amazing. Now that you think about it, if you are a publisher back then to 2012, well, the battle's over. Who's going to buy this book? Well, isn't that strange? And what's interesting about 2012 is that's really the year where vaping kind of really cracked through and started really kind of making an impact, certainly in the U.S. for one. Was there any discussion of vaping, or let's use the term e-cigarettes at that time? That's what the term would have been for sure. Was there discussion about that at all?
There was, and the outline of the book as it's published today, is actually very similar to what we initially proposed way back in 2012. So even then, I could tell that e-cigarettes were going to be an issue of increasing relevance, and I had planned one of the later chapters in the book to be about tobacco harm reduction. As it happens, I think it's actually good that it's taken this long to get the book out, because so much more information has come out in the time since then that I wouldn't have had any access to or any way of knowing back in 2012. So the book's a lot less speculative than it might have been if I'd published it right at that time. And right. The timing obviously couldn't be better at least from a news relevance perspective. I wish we had different news that it was tied to right now.
Right.
But as the only book that's really out right now with an in-depth look at vaping, it's pretty well positioned to be relevant.
So let's talk about that timing for a second. And we've got some time tonight, just so our viewers know. Jacob has got some tea. Was it tea or coffee in the end he ended up making?
We went with tea, and this is my F.A. Hayek tea mug, so we'll give him a little promotion there.
Oh my gosh, you're on the right show, my friend. You are on the right show. I've got some surprises then for you too.
All right.
I brought some surprises. So yeah. We had Professor Donald Bordeaux on.
Oh, yeah.
About a year and a half ago, talking about liberty and liberty vaping issues and stuff like that. And it was a little bit of a squish for a whole bunch of people. Couldn't quite understand why. I'm just going. He's the chair of the F.A. Hayek, It's hard for people to totally get that, but that knocked me off of my loop there.
Right.
So explain for our viewers just a little bit, because you're a media guy, I'm a media guy, and I love hearing this from other media guys, and I want to get some of your shine on RegWatch. But you've write for Atlantic and Reason. Give us the whole ball of wax there, so they really truly understand. You're all over the place, like in a good way.
Right. So my background prior to moving to Portland, Oregon, was I graduated college and moved to Washington, D.C. With an interest in working in public policy. So I worked or interned very briefly with the Institute for Humane Studies. And then my final job in D.C. was I worked in the press department at the Cato Institute. So I was doing very, very little original writing then. I wasn't a policy analyst at Cato by any means. But I was constantly in their press department, and I was doing some freelance writing at the time. But decided DC wasn't for me, and I just moved on a whim to Portland, Oregon 11 years ago, and pursued an entirely different lifestyle.
So you bought a balaclava? You've got
Yeah, not quite, but I did buy a bicycle, and lots of good coffee gear. And I lived the Portland lifestyle of spending lots of time in coffee shops, which turns out to be good for writing.
But there has to be a very limited number of libertarians there.
That's true. There are a few of us, but I fit in well. I've maybe drifted a bit more to the left liberal libertarian side as opposed to the more Republican right-wing libertarian side that I grew up with in Houston, Texas. So I fit very comfortably into the Portland milieu, which is not as violent or overrun with Antifa as people on the right sometimes make it out to be.
Well, either way, all I can say is I'm happy we got somebody on the inside.
That's right. And it's a good place to be. And we people are surprisingly receptive to you.
Right. Mm-hmm. So that's fantastic. So a good place to start is I've pulled out a quote. And I've got a couple of them for us to go through. And again, we're extending each one of our RegWatch lives. Like for 30 years, I've been in television, and all of our RegWatch stuff for the last 4 years has all been, our professionally sit down, shot, edited pieces. And then we really wanted to start doing live, and we started doing that about 7 months ago. And they were proper disasters, as they should be. They should be. And we're just coming out of that right now. But having to do the one-man band thing, which I've done all my life, I've always shot and reported, written and voiced and edited my own stuff. But you add this live thing to it, and it's just that one extra thing. It's like, maybe you can't ride a bike at the same time and chew gum. So here's what we're going to do. So my audience is going to be okay if this works, and it does work. Great. So here's the quote. This is from The Rediscovery of Tobacco, Smoking, Vaping, and the Creative Destruction of the Cigarette by Jacob Grier. And I'm not sure if I got the start here right when I copy-pasted this. The banishment of smokers from social spaces has, however, made it almost impossible to contemplate that tobacco deserves any tolerance. Smoking has become a low-status activity. Less than a fifth of Americans currently smoke, and the habit lingers mostly among those with less education and lower incomes. Tobacco use is viewed as pure vice, and the smoker as a hapless addict deserving only pity or scorn. So, Jacob, pity or scorn, I think all of our viewers would understand that, though some, would even think that right now it's not even about pity or scorn anymore. It's almost total derision and banishment.
Yeah, I think that's completely accurate. The reality of smoking, at least in terms of cigarettes in the U.S., is we've seen over time that it's increasingly correlated with people who either didn't complete high school or didn't go much beyond high school, and who probably have lower paying jobs. And at the same time, starting in about 2002, 2003, we had all these smoking bans that start passing, where we kick them out of restaurants, we kick smokers out of bars, then we start extending those to patios, and now even to entire downtown areas in certain cities. So if you're someone who is reading a lot of media, and not to overuse the term elite, which I think is overused a lot of the time in political analysis, but if you're an educated person who's thinking about these issues, you probably don't encounter cigarette smokers very often anymore. And if you do, it's only in passing, and you're probably unhappy about it because you're smelling the smoke and maybe it's getting on your clothes. So I think it's become very hard to take smokers seriously and to treat them with respect for a lot of people who don't have a lot of encounters with smokers. And at the same time, anyone alive today probably only associates smoking with the cigarette, which for reasons I'm sure we'll go into later is the deadliest version of tobacco that was ever invented. But that's an anomaly historically when you also had many other forms of tobacco use, which we now don't think about as much as we used to.
Yes, deadliest form of nicotine is definitely the tobacco, the cigarette. But it wasn't always that way, though, right? I mean, this is a 20th century phenomenon almost, or 1880 kind of an issue, isn't it?
Yeah, 1880 would be the big year. So you certainly had people smoking cigarettes in some form for probably as long as we know of. We have evidence of people taking reeds in Central America and filling them with powdered tobacco and smoking that. So it's not a brand new technology. But you did have two really important changes in the 1800s. One was what they called bright tobacco, which was an agricultural development. And so the kind of richer, darker tobaccos that we were used to before, we found out that if we grew them more inland from the coast of the United States and also changed the way we cured them, instead of using direct heat from fires, which is the way it was done for a long time, they moved the fires outside of the curing barns and started directing them inward with flues. It doesn't seem like this would be a really big deal, but it actually had a dramatic effect on the pH of the smoke. And for reasons of biology, a alkaline smoke is very hard to inhale, but you're able to take the nicotine in through your oral gums, your lips, your tongue, your gums. And so you tend to just puff on that tobacco and not deeply inhale it. But with these new bright tobaccos, the opposite is true. You don't get as much in your mouth, but because they're more acidic, it turns out to be very, very easy to inhale. And suddenly you had a form of smoked tobacco that people would draw all the way into their lungs really deeply and get the sudden spike of nicotine,
right? Which
is not the way most people historically would have smoked. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say that often in the book you do make the point about that deep draw into the lungs. It was something you focused on a bit.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that makes cigarettes in particular so lethal. Because I mean, any type of tobacco smoke, anytime you take a tobacco leaf and you set it on fire, you're producing a carcinogenic smoke. And sometimes you'll hear cigar smokers, say, "Oh, my tobacco is natural. It doesn't have those chemicals like cigarettes. It doesn't really have anything to do with it. It's still producing the smoke." The big difference is how you consume it. And if you lightly puff on it, you're not completely avoiding inhaling it. That's something that's going to happen regardless. But there's still a big difference between lightly puffing and intentionally drawing the smoke as deeply into your lungs as you can to get that big nicotine hit, which is what the cigarette made possible with the bright leaf.
Right, yeah. The bright leaf, and then and then in the States too. We won't stay forever on the history stuff, but it's important. The history of the actual anti-smoking crusade is vitally important. But there was something that I found very interesting. I think two things from the U.S. side was that Turkish mix that became really the de facto
Yeah.
And also the actual trust breakup. I've got a lot of understanding about the progressives' war on trust breakups, but nobody ever focuses. Certainly don't see Ken Burns and PBS focusing on the tobacco trust breakup. They'll tell you all day long about Ida Tarbell, right?
Right. Yeah, it was a big story. Start with the tobacco trust. So the other really important development was no matter how much people liked cigarettes, it still didn't make sense economically to buy them the way we would buy them in the 20th century, which is to have them pre-assembled for us. Most people, if they smoke cigarettes at all, were having to buy their own papers and their own loose tobacco and roll it themselves. I mean, economically, it didn't make sense to hire somebody else to do this for you. So you had a few firms who were, employing these teams of people to hand roll cigarettes, but this is obviously very inefficient, and it raises the costs substantially. So in the 1870s, you started seeing prizes offered for anyone who could invent a machine that could replace all these human rollers. And the person who did that was a guy named James Bonsack, who was actually just a teenager, but he created the first cigarette rolling machine that was able to be commercially put to use. And it's kind of a long story there, but the bottom line is suddenly we had an extremely addictive product and also a way to put it out at massive scales. So basically a 500-fold increase in productivity over the course of a decade or two. And so that just made it possible for these cigarettes to flood the market and start competing with what actually at the time the most popular form of tobacco use was chewing tobacco.
So hence the argument that it's capitalism and mass production and industrialization. It's the industrialization of the murdering of millions of people, blah, blah, blah. You've got to thank Adam Smith for that.
You could put it that way. Somebody could put it that way.
Somebody does.
But it was commercially driven, and it was a technological innovation that let this happen. And to be fair, at the time, nobody knew that the cigarette would turn out to be so much more dangerous than every other form of tobacco. People knew that tobacco had risks, but at the time, nobody knew how different cigarettes would be.
Right. And then, so after World War I, it really did become a mass consumer product. And then all the machinations started then with that.
Exactly. And this is one case where the government clearly helped, because during World War I, this was a period where there was a lot of opposition to smoking and cigarettes in particular, but it became patriotic to send cigarettes to the boys at the front. And so both nonprofit groups and the federal government installed a massive buying scheme to buy from all of the big cigarette companies and ship their products overseas. And that really, more than anything else, is what allowed the cigarette to take over the market. All these soldiers who were off in World War I and came back from Europe surviving probably came back with a cigarette addiction. And that's right about when the cigarette eclipsed cigars and chewing tobacco and everything else to become the number one product in the U.S.
It became the number one product?
Well, the number one tobacco product, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Fair enough. So I guess the way you're talking about that there is just to remember how important tobacco was. I mentioned this in a live stream a couple of days ago when I was on somebody else's show. I haven't actually talked about this that much on ours, is the sheer fact that alcohol and tobacco excise taxes were the only revenue for the United States of America, for the federal government, for like 200 years.
Right. And tobacco was even used as a form of currency in the early days of the settlement of the U.S. It was one of the key crops that helped drive settlement on the coast. Unfortunately, it was also one of the crops that drove the slave trade because it's a very labor-intensive crop, and part of the way that colonists addressed that was by importing slaves. So a lot of bad effects that go along with that, obviously. But that's a little bit tangential to the story we're telling today.
You haven't been watching a lot of RegWatch, I'll tell you. I did a piece in January called How Anti-Colonialism is Driving the Anti-Vaping Crusade. Because there's just, you have to be able, we'll get in there because I want to hear what you have to think, but one of the reasons why I was so excited about your book is because you were specifically talking about some of these direct connections in terms of colonialism, the tobacco, and the slave trade. I mean, that's very important because when you're living in a world where, and we're speaking of America, when you're living in a world where American hatred is almost exactly like that's what's taught at high schools and universities and probably at elementary too as well. Basically, if you follow the Howard Zinn school of what America is, you're going to believe that the original sin is slavery, and the original crop that funded that was not cotton, it was tobacco.
Yeah, I'm not familiar as much with the Zinn argument, but yeah, I know the main crops driving the slave trade were cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane.
Yes.
I believe are the big three for the New World.
It was it was the circle too, right? Or
the triangle trade.
The triangle trade, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I don't think there's any escaping that, but I also don't think that necessarily tells us anything about vaping today.
no, but it's but what I want to ask you is the impulse about that drives these people. So let's pick apart some of the details first, and then if we happen to end up on the same spot, that we do. If we don't, we don't.
Okay.
I'm going to go to the second quote that we have. And this is you writing, of course. Again, I found that the landscape of smoking research had shifted considerably since the days when bold epidemiologists took on deceitful tobacco companies to conclusively prove that cigarettes were causing an epidemic of lung cancer. When the companies settled lawsuits with state governments in 1998, they agreed to shut down the industry-funded institutes that provided pro-smoking talking points and to funnel tobacco money. And let me just see here, sorry, and to anti-smoking researchers and advocacy groups. While this was certainly a positive development in some respects, anti-smoking activists lost an incentive for doing rigorous science. When they defanged their longtime adversaries, they found themselves free to say anything they wanted without fear of contradiction and say anything they did. That was well written, my friend.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so this reflects sort of my own experience starting to write about these issues. I started probably back around 2008 or 2009 to really start following this. Actually, maybe a couple years before that. And initially, I just came to it as a libertarian guy who likes to smoke every once in a while. And for me, that was enough to oppose smoking bans. I just took a very straightforward view of consenting adults have the right to choose where they work, where they patronize, what kind of businesses they have, and the government shouldn't be involved. It's something for the market to sort out. So I didn't really pay attention to the science at the time in terms of secondhand smoke. I kind of accepted it at face value in the sort of vague, abstract sense that I assumed that secondhand smoke is bad, and but didn't really think that was the most important issue to be discussing. But of course, we found out that one, that was very important because the libertarians lost all the smoking ban fights and continue to do so. Where that argument didn't carry the day. But also, as I did start looking into the science, I was blown away by some of the absolutely wild claims that were being made that could not be substantiated by any means by scientists in the tobacco field. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of those soon, but the idea that the shutting down of the tobacco institutes was a key factor in this comes something I got from Michael Siegel, who is a career anti-smoking researcher who used to be at the Centers for Disease Control. He's testified against tobacco companies. He supports indoor smoking bans. He has a ton of credibility in the field. But he started a blog, and he started criticizing his peers in tobacco control in the early 2000s when they started making these completely unsubstantiated claims and going way beyond the evidence. And one of the things he attributed that to was the shutting down of these tobacco institutes that nobody would say are producing honest science. They obviously made a lot of disingenuous arguments, but what they did do is they kept the anti-smoking side on their toes, and if there was any weakness in the arguments that the anti-smoking side said, these guys would come to the press and point that out and criticize it. So when they shut those down, that check on quality was sort of taken away, and that is part of what led to these wild claims being put out there and the press just reporting them unquestioningly.
So in your analysis, because all of your research that you've done and you've been watching everything going on regarding the vaping epidemic, and then now the lung scare, is this just, sheer just battle tactics? Or, I mean, are they really, do they know they're lying when they're pushing out the fake science, or when the reporters are, being so hysterical? I mean, what's your thought on that?
Well, I think on the research side, it's probably more ideology than anything, and that can be very blinding on people. But it certainly feels very familiar now as someone who watched the anti-smoking or the secondhand smoke and smoking ban debates 10 years ago. This feels like deja vu when I see where this research is coming from and the quality of the claims that are being made. It takes me right back to these blog posts we were writing 10 years ago about how people were reading way too much into very flimsy evidence and making claims they couldn't substantiate, and the press, not knowing any better, would just run with it. And I think we're certainly seeing that repeat right now.
Sure, we definitely are.
Yeah.
Let me just put us over here to the internet, or over to my computer, and I'm going to just grab something here.
Sure.
As we're just freewheeling it, have a sip of tea. Oh, and I guess the one question that is going to be on absolutely everyone's mind. I have not asked Jacob this question. Do you vape?
I don't.
Okay.
I've tried it. I've taken experimental puffs on vapes because I've been curious. And I've got a number of friends and coworkers who have been cigarette smokers who have quit, but through e-cigarettes. There was one guy in particular I used to work with who would get very enthusiastic when he got a new piece of hardware. He worked in the restaurant industry, which can be extremely stressful, and that makes it hard to quit smoking. But he would find new, e-cigarettes of the more custom variety and new flavors. And he would get very excited, and every once in a while I'd try them with him just to taste it and see what it's like. But for him, it was a way to drastically reduce or quit smoking.
So based on everything you know, does vaping work?
I think there's a lot of evidence it does. We talk a little bit in the book. The best study we have so far is a randomized control trial from England that had, I think, close to 900 participants, and it found that people who tried to quit with e-cigarettes had a higher success rate than people using more traditional products like nicotine gums or patches, and maybe a similar rate to some of the more medicinal approaches. So yeah, I mean, quitting smoking is hard by any means, and we have tons of evidence that people who are addicted to smoking and try to quit do have a high rate of going back, and often takes multiple tries. But we also know that cold turkey is, in many cases, least likely to succeed, and that e-cigarettes may be one of the best methods for optimizing success, even if it's obviously not perfect. Lots of people try with e-cigarettes and still go back as well.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, you ask any smoker how many times they give it a shot, and it's in the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s
Right.
sometimes. I mean, it's just unbelievable. There's the law of unintended consequences, and I really truly believe in this particular issue. They're just like, so I use the term progressives a lot because that's very accurate term to describe, the people and the ideology that's against here. If you think that it's not, please push back on that. But I do use progressive a lot. And so, the progressive, public health battle is one that's kind of shorn with, because it's progressive, language gets played with a lot, right? And when language gets played with a lot, truth gets played with a lot. And you get a lot of maneuverability and room inside of truth. The use of facts, the construction of meaning, all of these kinds of things are, squarely right in their bailiwick. And so that's why, I'm suspect of science that's coming out of, progressive, entrenched mills, right? Which seems to be what tobacco control science is. It's progressive science, except for the small groups of enclaves and, the Dr. Siegels of the world, and there's plenty more, and they've all been on our show. The big thing that I want to get you to discuss here, because you wrote about it in your book, is how scientists at one point in the anti-smoking battle became targets of the tobacco control movement. Describe how they were targeted. Describe what happened to them, and we'll start there.
Yeah, so the big shift happened around the 1970s. And by that time, the dangers of first-hand smoking were undeniable to anyone except a tobacco executive. The science was very, very clear. that smoking both increased your risk of lung cancer and heart disease and many other things. And obviously the responses to that were extremely dishonest within the tobacco industry. But then we started looking at, what's the next step, and it became politically useful to find harms from secondhand smoke. If you want to pass restrictions on where people can smoke, and as a new way of, they were very explicit about this, even in the 1980s, of denormalizing smoking. And one of the scientists, who's one of the leading activists against smoking, even calls it, we need to make smoking an antisocial act. And to do that, you have to make it not just about the smoker, but about how it affects other people. And there's multiple ways to approach that. But obviously the big one that everybody thought of first was the effect on lung cancer. This is a difficult thing to study, as you can imagine, because it's hard to differentiate who's exposed and who isn't, and the effects, most importantly, are much, much smaller. And so most of the studies that came out were initially of wives who had smoking husbands. And the assumption being they're exposed to their husband's smoke in the home, and if they don't smoke themselves, you can see if they have higher rates of lung cancer than wives whose husbands don't smoke. And that's a good way to approach it. But what came out of this is the early studies did find an effect, but it was 1/10 of the effect that you see, or less, with regard to active smoking. And then other studies came out and didn't find an effect. And so part of the reason these became so intense is that the fights were over whether this effect was real and small or didn't exist, as opposed to the fights over smoking, where it was undeniably large and there was no honest way to deny it at that point.
So just to make sure everyone understands this, you're talking about actual lung cancer and the proof the effects were small?
Right. Yeah. And so they talk about, they put this in terms of relative risk. So if you're a non-smoker versus a smoker, what's your relative risk that over your lifetime you're going to get lung cancer? And if you're a cigarette smoker, these studies are 10, 20, 30 times and higher. That's your relative risk, which is extremely huge. Almost nothing else that anybody does voluntarily is going to give you that kind of elevated risk. With the lung cancer, it was more like 1.5 to 2.4 in this range. So it's very small effects. And obviously all of these estimates also have a range of values that they could be finding. And so if you look at the really big studies, they tended to find small effect or no effect. And then if you look at smaller studies or studies that had other flaws, that's where you get the bigger effects. So that's not to say that there's no risk, and it's not to say that the risk isn't real. And the Surgeon General's report puts the risk at, I think their range goes from 1.12 to 1.43, which for a disease that's really rare in non-smokers to begin with is a very low level of risk. The flip side of that is scientists whose studies did not support this work ended up being attacked as shills for big tobacco, no matter how good their work was. And so the biggest example of this was James Enstrom and Jeffrey Cabot had a data set spanning 39 years of data on people's health that they were able to assign to different values of secondhand smoke exposure. And it was a landmark study, and it didn't find any effect on either lung cancer or heart disease. And nobody's saying this was the best study or it's the only study that anybody should care about, but they were just viciously attacked for their findings and accused of being tobacco shills because the last bit of their funding came from one of these tobacco institutes. But there was very little criticism of the actual work.
Right.
And now if we look back, now that smoking bans have become passed and standard everywhere, just a few years ago, another study from Stanford with a similarly large data set, I think 79,000 women over a period of more than a decade, also found no statistically significant effect. But that was just greeted with a shrug. People, now that the fight was won, nobody attacked them for having that finding. So,
okay, so let's put a television writer's technique to it and put it to a fine point.
Yeah.
The research on secondhand smoke that was used to tear the liberty away from tens of millions of Americans was a fraud.
I wouldn't say that part was a fraud, but I would say it's much more controversial than people realize. The evidence is much more mixed. Where we start getting into what I would call more dishonest science was around 2004 or so. That's when we start looking at not your chronic effects of being exposed to secondhand smoke all the time, but claims made about what happens just when you're briefly exposed to secondhand smoke. And this is where I think you can say that a lot of the work that was done was clearly, at the very least, highly politicized, and done so in intentional ways that hid the flaws in the research and were used for maximal claims to be able to pass new smoking bans. The biggest one we talk about that opens the chapter on the secondhand smoke science is what we call the Helena Miracle, which is a study that claimed that in 6 months the town of Helena, Montana, banned smoking and saw the rate of heart attacks in the entire city drop by 60%, which is just a completely wild finding. I mean, if that were true, it would be a miracle, and no matter how libertarian you are, you might be tempted to say, well, maybe smoking bans are good, but it was also wildly implausible. And people were very skeptical at the time, including a few journalists, but for the most part, it was just repeated around the world to help justify smoking bans. But now, 10 years later, which is what I wrote about on Slate, lots of new studies have come out with much larger data sets that have said that either this effect is small or it doesn't exist. And I think either one of those is going to temper your conclusion about how much secondhand smoke we should allow.
But correct me if I'm wrong, it is that research, though, that was used as the justification, the argument to get around the J.S. Mill position, right? In terms of your liberty, right? So, or as Ben Shapiro would frame it, the wave my arms around rule. As long as I'm not hitting anyone, I should be allowed to wave my arms around, right?
Right, exactly.
Right.
And so by exaggerating the danger, these very alarmist studies were reported in the New York Times, they were in the BBC, they were in the Associated Press. So everybody read about these and developed these beliefs that not just that living with a smoker for 30 years is going to be dangerous, but that entering a bar with smokers for half an hour is going to give me the same risk of dying from a heart attack of a lifelong smoker. And these are the kind of claims that were being put out with and then not being skeptically reported, and really giving people a skewed idea of how dangerous secondhand smoke is. So it's important to distinguish between long-term studies with large data sets and small effects but measurable effects, versus these very alarmist short-term studies that don't hold up to longer scrutiny.
So trust me, from the vaping side, if there's one thing I can tell you is that ad nauseum, all you hear from FDA and people in anti-vaping world is that, well, vaping, there's no long-term studies. It's anecdotal, right? But these short, small sample studies were enough to rip liberty away. But then when we get to the last 10 years and tens of millions of smokers or vapors are everywhere, they don't even want to, they literally will say, we can't listen to what you're saying because it's anecdotal.
Right. And like you said, people say there's no long-term studies, which is true. But that doesn't mean we're repeating the same mistakes we made with cigarettes. We've had 60 years of science on all the carcinogens and other damaging chemicals that are in cigarettes, and we know that they are greatly reduced in vapor. So that's not to say that 30 years from now we won't find that there's any effects. I think there are legitimate concerns, but we're not just in the dark here and have no option but to wait for 30 years, and we can't possibly make any guesses until we've done that.
Oh, that is fantastic.
Yeah.
There's audience members right now going, yay! Yeah. So, all right. So what I wanted to just bring up here, because we're talking about the science, because, I mean, you can't have your eyes even open a little bit and not see the crap science that's coming out. That's actually coming out from universities and other academic departments and stuff like that, making claims like you wouldn't believe. The press release, when you read the press release, you know exactly why the reporters framed the story that way, because the press release just served it up for them like that. And then when you read the report, it's obviously in the abstracts softer, conclusions even softer, and then there's caveats all the way through, and then you realize, well, they didn't really find anything. But
right.
The press department...
Say that Helena study of what we call the Helena heart miracle is the perfect example of that. Not only did the press not read the study, they couldn't, because the scientist actually released the results in a press release a year before the study was published. So there wasn't even anything to critique. So the report went out saying that they'd reduced heart attacks by 60%. as it happened, when the study was actually published, it was 41%. And then if you look at the confidence interval, which is what tells you, what the broad range of estimates could be, it was actually more like 1 to 79%. So that tells you that they had a huge level of uncertainty about even the size of the effect, which anyone would know if they read the study, but the study didn't exist when they sent out the press release that was reported all over the world.
That's corrupt, if you ask me.
Right. And that's part of what that study was one of the ones that encouraged Michael Siegel to start speaking out and criticizing his peers. And he started calling this science by press release, where you put out the results in advance of anyone being able to comment them or critique them.
So let me just say this, that when I read that in your book, and let's just make sure we do this right now.
Yeah.
I highly encourage everyone to go buy this book. It is a fantastic read. There are definitely things in there that if you've been following the history and the whole machinations of the anti-smoking crusade, things that you'll definitely recognize, but just delivered in such a concise, precise way. You are not bogged down by detail by Mr. Greer here. You get the good stuff and moving on along a right track. I highly recommend it, and you can get it at Amazon. And I did a check. Now I only checked 3, but definitely U.S. for sure, of course, Canada and the U.K. So, and we do have some viewers in Europe. I would imagine that you can get it there too as well.
Yeah, it should be coming along, and the hardcover is distributed through Ingram, which has global distribution. So if nothing else, you can ask your local bookstore to get it. And it might take a while, but I know it will get there eventually.
Well, it's definitely highly worth it for sure. It's a great book. I've been going through it. I pretty much went through it pretty quick. You were kind enough to send me a digital copy. So, all right.
And what you said is what I was trying to approach it as. I didn't want to do a comprehensive history, which to some extent has been done before, but I wanted each chapter to basically distill an idea that's worth exploring down and give good examples and explain what that implies now for the current debate. Opening with how tobacco spread around the world, then going to how the cigarette specifically took over. There's one chapter just about secondhand smoke science and talking about what's reliable and what isn't, and onward from there.
Yeah, no, very extremely awesome. And one of the things that I loved, and now back to, I remember now exactly what it was, where I was going when your F.A. Hayek knocked me off a loop. That was basically with the fact that this thing was published on September 18th. And so there's material in this book when you're in the non-burning issues chapter, which is the last chapter of the book. And I mean, you're reading about stuff that was just happening in July. So let's talk a little bit about that. I'd like to get some author stuff on that. So what was the last thing you could get in there before the thing went, you had to send it to get printed? So when was that? I know there was July. Was there some August in there? And what was that like? Did you have to keep adding stuff and pulling it back from the publisher? And
so this is print on demand. I am the publisher. So the luxury there is I was able to change things right up to the last moment. I ended up talking about the current debate over the lung illnesses right now. Wasn't able to put too much in because the one constraint that I did have is my illustrator, Andrew Borer, who was amazing to work with. If I started adding content at that point, I would need all new cover files for him because I'd be making the spine of the book thicker. So I was resistant to do that to him after all the changes he'd already made for me. But at the end of that chapter, there was about 2/3 of a blank page where I was able to add an addendum about everything that's happening right now to at least acknowledge it and give people some guidance on what to expect on that.
Oh, that's just excellent. That's just excellent. Yeah. And by the way, in terms of the kind of vapor ethic of creating a multi-billion-dollar industry from the consumer ground up, a lot of people appreciate that this is self-published, no doubt.
Yeah, and it's an interesting process. I learned a lot. I don't know how much you want to go into it, but software, distribution, all these different things that, having done a previous book, the more traditional route, I just got to hand off to people. So this is obviously much more hands-on, and it's a steep learning curve, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. You haven't seen the physical copy yet, but if you buy one, you would have no idea that it's a self-published print-on-demand book. The quality that comes out of these right now is amazing. It's a real amazing tech story that you can produce a book like this at pretty low cost as well.
Oh, dude, I think there's probably definitely some of our audience is interested in that, and I certainly am. I've got a bunch of questions for you at some other time. Like,
Yeah.
wow, that is just awesome, man. Oh my God, that is awesome.
Yeah.
Literally, I'm like, did you write it on Word and then move it over to Scrivener, or did you write it in Scrivener?
Reverse, yeah. I wrote in Scrivener. That's for me. Like that's the best for organizing the whole book structure. So
Yeah.
for people who don't know, this is a writing software that's designed for longer projects. And one of the cool things about it is you always have this kind of bird's eye view of what you're working on, where you have a sidebar with chapters and subsections. And if you realize that something needs to be moved, you can just drag and drop it to a different part of the manuscript. And it's very good for just visualizing what you're producing. Like in my case, originally the chapter on secondhand smoke and smoking bans was one massive chapter. And by having that overhead view, I could realize, like, no, this needs to be 2 chapters so I can fully address each story and make them separate. So once I get that done, then I go into Word, and I put each chapter into a Word document and edit more intensively there and send out copies to other people with track changes on so I can see what their comments are. And then I go into a software called Vellum, which is what's made for outputting your manuscript into either a PDF or a digital book file, like for Kindle. And everything I read said, don't try to do this any other way. Vellum is the most expensive one, but it's worth the money, and it makes it incredibly easy. And all of that is true. It's fantastic software. The one downside is it's only for Mac, and I'm a PC guy. So to do this whole thing, I also have to rent a Mac computer on the cloud and log in remotely and transfer files through Dropbox. So everything's kind of hacked together at that step, but it worked out really well. And
so you definitely are not a proper Portland hippie then, because everyone's
right.
a Mac there.
It is, yeah. There's not as many PCs here, but I like the openness of the PC market.
That's funny. So, just one last question, as we've just lost, half our viewers, I'm sure.
Yeah, they're like, why are we talking about this?
Why are we talking about this? When you write in Scrivener, are you writing like the big open page, or do you create what you think is going to be the size of your real page that you're going to print? So you're writing into the actual form.
Oh, I just do the big page for like each section. Yeah,
right.
I figured out.
Cool, man. That's all. That's wicked shit, man.
Yeah,
that's wicked. Like we're cable. We're not HBO though.
All right, we can drop
we're
them.
basic cable. I can say that. Maybe I
awesome.
can't.
Good to know.
That was a great interlude. So all right. So let me just jump us over here, and you should be seeing that. Yeah, that's great. So we're back. Let's jump back into the details. I've got on RegWatch here, I just curated a piece that came out from Bloomberg. I think it was last Friday. So, I mean, all of this stuff is going crazy, right? It's just, Jacob, I was saying to our audience the other day that the very first CDC statement, media advisory, that went out on the lung illness was August 16th. And it was really short, didn't have a lot of information, which of course, right? It was August 16th. And by September 11th, there was a presidential vaping ban.
Yeah, super fast.
Well, yeah, like that's not even super fast. That's except for going to war. When have you ever seen that something happen like that in less than 30 days? It's unbelievable.
Yeah. One of my friends on Twitter, Amelia Howard, who I reference in my book, she's in Canada as well. She's doing a PhD on the innovation of e-cigarettes.
Yep. And
her comment was they might have found something suspicious about Barron Trump's USB, and that's what inspired the move.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I believe there's something much more treacherous going on.
Yeah.
Right. And Trump was just ripe for the picking, and they just moved. Right. I think that they were searching for a pretext. I think that's been going on for quite some time. And when these lung illnesses started popping up, they grabbed it. They immediately attached it to vaping and e-cigarettes, and they ran. I mean, and they just
absolutely,
ran.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's true of the CDC, of a lot of the anti-vaping scientists. It's true of Michael Bloomberg. This, like you said, it's a pretext and it's a scapegoat. and a very irresponsible, as we now know, reaction to this, because it probably demonized the wrong product and didn't let people know what products they shouldn't be using, which increasingly looks to be almost entirely tied to these black market THC cartridges.
Right.
And even now in Portland, which is, I would like to think, one of the most educated cities in the country when it comes to marijuana, I talk to people who don't know the difference and who think it's a nicotine cigarette thing and are happily puffing away on THC cartridges. So they've done a real disservice to marijuana users, I think, along with everything they're doing to demonize vaping.
Sure. I mean, they definitely have.
Yeah. And like you said, Trump
sure
is easy to manipulate, probably. So it probably wasn't hard for the leaders at the CDC and FDA to push that.
Yeah, but, and you know, it's definitely not just Trump, though, right? Because the fact of the matter is that there's a good chunk of people in the conservative side on the right that are progressive. I mean, progressivism isn't just a left thing. It does cross party lines.
Yeah, I think there's an impulse, certainly on both sides, even though I identify more with left-wing progressivism, to want to centrally plan, drug use like this and have a really firm control of the industry and stop people from using a product you disapprove of. There's differences. People on the left tend to be okay with marijuana and hate nicotine, and on the right, it's often been the reverse of that. But now we're seeing plenty of people on the right were happy to restrict nicotine as well, and vapors right now are suffering the brunt of that.
Yeah, it does. It's an easy win for them in this world of social justice, because I do frame the anti-vaping crusade as a social justice issue, but they don't scream about social justice. That's the thing that's weird. But the way that they react is very much the same. Extravagant claims, hysteria, the whole bit, right? It's just a bit different. It's because it's bureaucrats that are being hysterical, right? It's not people protesting, with pink hair. If you have pink hair, I'm not insulting you. I'm just telling you that you're just announcing your political beliefs. Same with green hair. All right, so back over here, because this is critical. So this came out on Bloomberg. Early signs of vaping health risks were missed or ignored. This I curated it yesterday, but the date, its release date, and I actually put way more. I fully put the story up.
Yeah.
We don't always do that, but when they're this big and it's Bloomberg, I don't care about taking all his content. It's our viewers need to see it, right? So
right.
It's up. So this went up on September 25th. So I guess what that was, Thursday, I guess, or something like that last week, Thursday or Friday. And so basically, they systematically go through and take down all of the science that supports vaping. So doctors and researchers scattered around the world saw problems, but nobody put two and two together. Scientists, regulators, and e-cigarette proponents missed, ignored, or downplayed signs that vaping could significantly damage the lungs for nearly a decade. A review of medical literature, government documents, and interviews with doctors show. So then, of course, this is all with, boom, first one is glance. It's
right.
fair to say that there were early warning signs that were missed.
And Stanton Glantz, for people who don't know, is the one who did the Hell in a Heart Attack study, and also the one who, in his pursuit of smoking ban, said we need to make smoking an antisocial act. So whether or not his science is good in this case, it is indisputable that he has a very long history of being ideologically opposed to smoking in any form. And so you should consider his background anytime you see his name come up in an article like this.
Ooh, can you go just a little bit more?
Yeah, so we often think of conflicts of interest that are declared in studies as being purely financial. We often don't think about ideology, but ideology can have just as big an effect on someone's work as financial, if not more so. And if you're talking about smoking, it's hard to find someone more ideologically opposed to it than Stanton Glantz. He was one of the founders for Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights. He's been an activist in favor of smoking bans for his entire career. And his science reflects that. Like I said, the big glaring example would be the Hell in a Heart miracle study, where they claimed to the press that they could reduce the rate of heart attacks by 60% in just 6 months, which anyone should have known was just a wildly improbable result, and it proved to be so over time. But he's behind a lot of the claims about vaping now. Obviously, every claim has to be addressed on its own merits, and I would say that on both sides, whether you're on the pro-vaping or the anti-vaping side. Every study, every bit of science stands on its own.
Right.
But you should consider someone's background and how that might affect their interpretation of something like what we're talking about now, and consider where they're coming from, both financially and ideologically.
So I put up the next quote over what you were saying there because it follows through, and you write in the Rediscovery of Tobacco. I always got discovery in my brain for that. A rapidly accumulating body of evidence suggests that products such as electronic cigarettes are far less dangerous than combustible tobacco, and that they are helping smokers quit their destructive habit. Instead of embracing these advances, however, anti-smoking groups feed the public a fear-driven narrative that associates vaping with cancer, heart disease, seizures, popcorn lung, exploding devices, and dangerous chemicals. Almost every single one of those last things there, Jacob, are something that Stanton Glantz has produced research on to support.
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly been finding any evidence of harm that he can and putting that in relation to vaping. The big one that came out a couple of years ago was, I believe he was involved with a study that said vaping doubles your risk of heart attacks. And then other researchers have since come in and shown that using the data that he was using, you couldn't actually sequence the heart attacks and the vaping in time. And a lot of the heart attacks probably happened before people even took up vaping, while a lot of them were smokers. So we're seeing how this might hold up over time. Like his past work, it may not do so well. But anytime I see Glantz involved with something, I take it with a huge grain of salt, knowing his past history, how poorly some of his previous studies have held up, and what his motivations are. I think he's someone who is always out there trying to demonize vaping. And in any scientific field, people get attached to a theory and they want to defend it. And he's attached to the theory that vaping is going to prove to be extremely harmful and probably not going to help people quit smoking. And so anytime he finds evidence in support of that, he's obviously going to highlight that, and he's going to suppress or reject evidence that doesn't fit the hypothesis.
So why is it, do you think, though, he continues to get funded? I mean, he just got a re-up, I think, on 5 years or $20 million.
Yeah, $20 million from the FDA. And that one, I just shook my head on that one. He's obviously very good at fundraising. He's got those connections. He gets them both from private groups and from the FDA. I think that's similar in a lot of fields. Once you have those connections and you have a publication record, you can keep building on that. But yeah, I was very disappointed when the FDA, which is trying to embrace harm reduction to some extent, decided that that's the person of all people who they should be awarding money to.
Let's talk about this lung illness thing right now.
Yeah, sure people are curious about that.
Yeah, what's your thoughts on that? Like, how are you rating what's going on here?
Well, I've got to tell you that when the news started coming out this summer, and I was doing layout on my book, I was very interested in this because if, as the headlines alleged, these illnesses were attached to nicotine vaping, I was going to maybe trash my book or look very foolish if I published it. So as you can imagine, I was reading up on the news every single day. And by the time I got close to publication and close to announcing the book, I felt confident enough with what I'd seen to feel fairly sure that this was probably not due to the commercial e-cigarettes that we've come to associate with nicotine use and with what millions of people have been doing for more than a decade. And that's the reason why. If this is not a question of using something for a very long time and developing some illness because of that. This was an acute illness that was clearly due to some kind of reaction to something that's in the products that people are vaping. Like, it was something new on the market that was causing this sudden uptick in cases. And so, regardless of whether that's nicotine or marijuana or something else, it tells you it's something different, and so then probably something that could also be addressed and fixed once you find out what that is. And as we got closer to publication, even now the CDC is acknowledging that almost all of these cases are people who were using THC products. And they're starting to zero in on that. I think we're going to see that turn out to be the case, that this ended up being kind of a non-issue in terms of what it tells us about nicotine vaping, at least in the short term, but does tell us a lot about how these marijuana cartridges are made and how black markets can lead to dangerous products like this. So to me, it's more of a warning to not create these same black market conditions for the nicotine market, which is exactly how many politicians are responding. They're seeing 800 people become ill due to black market products for THC, and their response is to create a new black market for nicotine, which to me is exactly backwards and hugely counterproductive to the goal of getting people to give up cigarettes, which we know kill 400,000 people a year, for something that, while not totally safe, is definitely lower risk.
Do you think that the CDC knew they were misleading the public?
I have no idea. I couldn't tell you what goes through their minds. But I can tell you that I think their response has been extremely irresponsible in terms of not getting people the accurate information they need. And I think they probably were inclined. Scott Gottlieb, who stepped down from the FDA recently, talked about how there was a divide between the two agencies, where the FDA was pretty receptive to e-cigarettes, despite all the obstacles they put in front of them, whereas the CDC was more opposed to it from the beginning. And so I think the officials there were probably more inclined to see evidence of harm and seize on it faster and put it out there, whereas people at the FDA were probably more cautious and maybe also had more experience with e-cigarettes to know that they probably weren't the cause of what was happening right then.
Is it fair to say, though, that the CDC's action in this matter is unconscionable?
Yeah, I would say that, especially later in the game. That it took them so long to acknowledge what's happening right now.
Yeah, I wonder, is it fair to say that that delay could have actually caused harm, maybe other illness, maybe other death?
Yeah, that's totally possible, and that's the short term. And in the longer term, to the extent that this is both we've already seeing this skewy people's perceptions of vaping, which we know were wrong to begin with. A lot of people don't understand the relative risk of e-cigarettes and conventional tobacco. And this whole scare has just made that a lot worse. So the other question is, how many cigarette smokers who might have switched to vaping aren't doing so now, either because they're scared and they think it's more dangerous than it really is, or because the products they want are about to get banned and they can't buy them even if they wanted to.
Right, and the state bans that have already gone into effect and others, in the process, and then the potential presidential ban, I mean, we're talking about a complete destruction of the market.
Yeah, and they saw today the news story in Michigan about police going store to store to make sure nobody was selling the wrong products, with penalties for up to 6 months in prison if you do continue to sell flavored vapor products. So this is happening faster than I expected. But at the beginning of this year, I wrote an article about how if we don't start from the premise that nicotine users are consenting adults with the right to do with their body what they want to, we're going to make the same mistakes we've made with past prohibitions and drug wars. To be fair, I didn't think that was going to mean 6-month prison sentences this soon, but that is now a threat that's hanging over people in the state of Michigan, and 3 years in the country of India as well. So I hope we don't, but I think it's very likely we'll see a lot more of these laws being passed where we're imposing very strict penalties on people for doing things that, at least up until recently, were perfectly legal.
Well, considering that you're able to legally consume nicotine and kill yourself, that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, nobody's criminalizing cigarettes yet, although I wouldn't hold my breath on that. I think we might see that in the next decade or so as well.
Isn't there some kind of constitutional thing or something like that that's protecting tobacco? I always thought that there was something going on there. Not just the MSA, but something else that made it very difficult to ban that product.
The Tobacco Control Act, which was what gave the FDA authority over tobacco, says they cannot ban products entirely, and they cannot mandate the removal of all nicotine. But the FDA seems to be interpreting that to mean they can mandate the removal of nearly all of the nicotine. And so the optimistic idea there is, by taking away almost all the nicotine from cigarettes, nobody new gets addicted to them, and anybody who is addicted to them has to switch to something like e-cigarettes or snus or nicotine gum, something different. The more pessimistic scenario, which I think is also likely, is you just create a black market for tobacco, because it's a relatively easy plant to grow, maybe not to grow well, maybe not to make a quality product, but if you want to grow tobacco and sell it in a black market, that's very difficult to stop. And we already see that with the taxes on cigarettes. And if we ban nicotine-containing cigarettes entirely, I think you'll see just even more black markets. And then if you're the government, you're faced with the question of what to do with that. Do you tolerate it and turn a blind eye, or do you start cracking down like you do on the war on drugs? So I think we're inviting a lot of the same mistakes that we've made with products like marijuana into nicotine, because we don't start with the premise that adults have this right to make this decision for themselves.
So it almost seems, and this is the reason why we've titled today's episode about pleasure, right? It's the pleasure principle. Well, they almost seem to not be able to understand that nicotine is something that can be, consumed pleasurably and should be. And I think from the vaping side, right, they thought they had the thing nicked with anti-smoking because they're progressives, so they own the kids in the schools, and they thought they had this generation mind warped perfectly, so where they're going to get their very first generation coming out, and they were going to be all perfect human beings. And part of that perfect human being, right, was going to be they were all completely not smoking, right, or off nicotine. And so the vaping is just this demon that just comes in, and all of a sudden it's just going to get them hooked with nicotine, and it destroys the entire, Jean-Jacques Rousseauian kind of idea of the utopian future of the youth becoming the adults and thus saving the world, right? Because that's the whole idea. It's all the youth. It's the youth. And but they never get the progressive utopia unless the youth become adults. And so there's that moment in time where they can get corrupted. And so that's what's happening. These 16, 17, and 18-year-olds are getting corrupted by Juul. It's just it's like tainted and stained and evil, and they're reacting that way. I'm using this language and reacting this way because that's the way the progressives are acting. They're acting like an entire generation of youth are spoiled and rotten from exposure to nicotine, and it's because they're crazy Rousseauians, right?
And if you come back to how we look at adults, I think if you were treating this consistently, you would be much more concerned about teen alcohol use right now. If you look at CDC numbers, they say more than 4,000 teens or 4,000 underage Americans die every year because of alcohol poisoning, which is far more than we could ever associate with vaping. But we don't see calls to ban White Claw or to ban flavored vodkas or things that appeal to adults but also appeal to young people and are easy to drink. And that's because we respect adult choices with regard to alcohol. We tend to respect them increasingly more with marijuana. There's lots of sort of appealing candy flavors if you go to any weed shop in Portland or Oregon or in Vancouver, I'm sure. But we still decide it's better for these products to be available in some kind of restricted access to adults, even though some kids get them. But we just don't regard adult nicotine users the same way. Like we said earlier, they're just viewed with contempt. And I see this on Twitter all the time. If I have something up about how e-cigarettes may be a safer way to consume nicotine, the response from people who don't respect nicotine users is not, well, that's great, this could save people's lives, or at least greatly reduce the harm. It's, well, if you're on nicotine, you're stupid anyway, because they just view nicotine as something that offers no benefits. And there's this denial that there's anything good about nicotine. And I just think that doesn't survive contact with actually knowing smokers. I think I spend probably more time around smokers than most people who are in a more traditional academic role who study this. Like just yesterday, I was going down the street and I saw people out on a sunny day having beers and smoking cigarettes and smiling and having a good time at a picnic table. And they sure didn't look like they weren't having a good time. From any casual observation, people were clearly observing what they're doing. And people who are against smoking seize on the fact that people who smoke cigarettes often say they want to quit and that they're so addicted and they can't, and that's totally true. But just because they're addicted doesn't mean they're also not taking pleasure in it. And so the question is, what does vaping open up possibility-wise? If it does turn out to be extremely low risk, why should we stigmatize it the same way that we currently stigmatize cigarette smoking? If the harms aren't at all proportional, we maybe shouldn't view it the same way or restrict it the same way, and people shouldn't panic about it the way they do right now.
a lot of people will say that that they're trying to quit because that's the mantra that has been driven into people's brains for the last 30 years, right? 40 years. So you kind of just get used to saying that. I mean, my last days of smoking and stuff. I mean, I'll tell you, there isn't a single one of our viewers who was a dedicated smoker, right? Who quit because they really wanted to, right? If your health is really bad, you're making some big choices about quitting. But even then, right? Nobody wants to stop smoking. Everyone loves smoking. Smoking was awesome. If smoking stayed cheap and didn't kill you, the whole world would be smoking.
Right. And like I come to this, as you said earlier, as a cigar smoker. So I don't smoke every day or even every week or every month. I go long periods of time without touching tobacco whatsoever. But I clearly enjoy it when I have it. I think it's fantastic. And, I could read some evidence about my very occasional cigar that convinced me it was so dangerous that I have to give it up. And if I was convinced of that, I would quit, but I would also acknowledge that I was losing something of value that was bringing me happiness on the times that I had it. And I would analogize that to coffee right now. Like coffee, as far as we know, is perfectly safe or even good for you by pretty much every measure. I absolutely love coffee, and I would have a hard time giving it up. But, let's say some major new study came out tomorrow that incontrovertibly, proved that coffee was causing some major disease. Suddenly I might continue drinking it, but I would also have very mixed emotions about drinking it now. It would be hard to enjoy it, knowing that I'm having it because I'm having a hard time giving it up and that it might be killing me. But that doesn't mean that before I knew that, yesterday I loved it. Clearly the pleasure is real. People smoke in service of addiction sometimes, but also because they enjoy nicotine and they enjoy the way it makes them feel. They can regulate their mood. They associate it with certain behaviors. Like for me, I have certain friends where part of how we bond is by having a cigar together, along with some scotch or some rum. And those pleasurable experiences are then not as pleasurable when you have to take the nicotine away.
Totally. And I just want to say for our viewers, because, again, I want to make sure that we're getting people out and ordering that book. Again, on Amazon, you can find it, The Rediscovery of Tobacco, Smoking, Vaping, and the Creative Destruction of the Cigarette. And in it, Jacob spends some really quality time talking about his quality time with a cigar and a good drink. And also, too, as well, some great stories about a local bar that got hit hard with the smoking bans. If you were conscious at all as a smoker back in the early 2000s and experienced the fascist police state coming down and removing your liberties, you will enjoy some of the stories that he's talking about in this book. It was reminiscent for me. Like I remember when the smoking ban happened in New York, and I was absolutely shattered over that. I was living basically in New York. This is 2003, right? I believe.
Mm-hmm. It sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And so I was bi-coastal, home in LA, and our headquarters is in New York. I'd go to New York for like a month and a half, stay in a corporate apartment and stuff like that. And one of the key things that I love so much about New York is you could still smoke like a human being, because by the time 2003 happened, it was already brutal in California, and in Vancouver, it was early. I mean, it was late 1999, 2000 or something like that, and things were getting pushed out. So New York was great because, woohoo, you could just smoke. You could smoke everywhere. It was awesome. So when New York fell, that was brutal. And then after that, London fell. Mm-hmm. And that was...
Yeah, in D.C. right around then, too, which is, by coincidence, it's when I left. I didn't leave because of the smoking ban, but it was imposed right about the time that I was leaving. And in fact, I've had very few cigarettes in my life, but the first cigarette I ever tried was on the final night of legal smoking in D.C., just because it seemed like the thing to do. It was the one that, and I didn't like it. Like, I didn't keep up with it, but the smoking ban encouraged me to take up cigarettes, at least for one night.
Right. So we've got about another 20 minutes or so left. I wanted us to do 2 hours. I've got some surprise stuff
Okay, I'm
sitting
intrigued.
here. Yeah, I've got some things. It's going to be interesting. We're going to see how that works. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick 3-minute break, everybody. If you run, smoke them if you got them, the old saying. And we'll be right back in 3.
All right.
3 and a bit, I guess, maybe.
All right.
Whatever. It'll be 3. There's a countdown. So let me just make sure I've got it right. I only ever use this countdown for when things go wrong. This is the first time doing it on purpose. Okay.
Nice.
1 second. Well, everybody, we're back from a nice quick break. Thank you very much for sticking with us. And I'm here with Jacob Grier. He is the author of a brand new book that is just out. I highly recommend going and getting this book on Amazon. It's The Rediscovery of Tobacco, Smoking, Vaping, and the Creative Destruction of the Cigarette. Jacob, thanks again for being here on RegWatch.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great.
That's awesome, man. You're great. This is wicked. So, got a good one for you.
Okay.
I'm constantly at odds with my viewers, lambasting them for just always blaming big tobacco or big pharma because I'm on the ideology side, right? I'm like, no, this is an ideology battle. Big tobacco, MSA money, all that stuff, yeah, plays a role, right? But, MSA money makes tobacco control too big to fail. I mean, totally. right? But I see it as more. But I want to ask you that because we don't have to agree. Is big tobacco behind this? Is the master settlement money that's something separate, and is it behind it? Like, what's the role?
I actually agree with you. I do think the MSA is very important in certain ways. I think there are probably very few people who are explicitly thinking about it in those terms, who are looking at this as a quid pro quo of, if I need to demonize vaping or I'm going to lose this funding. I think that rarely happens. I think it is much more ideological. And what I think you might see is these groups that get their money through the MSA have a long history of being ingrained in this very anti-smoking mindset that comes about from the fact that anyone alive today, when we think about smoking or nicotine, we only think of cigarettes. And so, like you said, this disruptive technology of e-cigarettes comes on the scene, potentially changes things around. They are predisposed to be against that. And I don't think it's a case of pure money. I think, like you said, it's the ideology of people who've been spending their entire careers in the anti-smoking movement and having a hard time breaking away from the ideas that they've spent their whole lives ingrained in.
Right.
I do think what's interesting is the founding of the Tobacco Control Act. There's a chapter in my book called Bootleggers and Baptists. Maybe we should talk about where that phrase comes from. Have you covered that on the show before?
No, you know what? We did have Christopher Snowden on the show a couple of years ago, but that's been some time now.
Cool. So this phrase is a really cool idea, and it comes from an economist named Bruce Yandel. And he describes how groups that you would think would hate each other, and probably do hate each other, come to support the same types of regulations. And so the semi-fanciful but not really fanciful example he used is Bootleggers and Baptists. And that's a reference to the blue laws that forbid alcohol sales on Sunday. Now, the Baptists, they're against alcohol, so they obviously have support for these laws about selling it on Sundays. But then the bootleggers, who have no moral qualms about it whatsoever, they see the idea of banning sales on Sundays as good for them, because then people have to buy it illegally on the black market from the bootleggers. So you end up with this dynamic where the Baptist, which said more broadly is anybody who's a part of a moral cause, whether that's public health or morality and what people should be doing, they provide the moral face of the argument, where the bootleggers are there kind of lobbying behind the scenes because they know they're going to profit from the regulation. Right. And you saw this, I think it's a great description for how the FDA law came about. To some extent also the MSA as well, but the FDA law in particular, you had all these health groups who were pushing for it, but then you also had Philip Morris pushing for it, which nobody talks about today, especially if they support the law. They don't want to talk about the fact that Philip Morris was the one lobbying for it behind the scenes. But what Philip Morris got out of it was they're the world's largest tobacco company, and they knew they had the means to get through whatever approval process they were able to put in place. So they secure their market share from Marlboro, and they become positioned to be the only ones able to get any new products like e-cigarettes, which were just kind of on the horizon then. I don't think anybody knew for sure how big they would be. Right. But they knew that they would have the resources to get their products through that regulatory process in a way that your mom and pop vape store clearly doesn't.
Right. And we've seen that. I mean, we've seen that with the, sporadic positioning that Juul has had with the regulation and their reaction to the scare. They just pulled out all of their lobbyists and everything else and just, caved last week.
I feel like Juul can't decide whether they think they're going to make it or not. And so, when they're scared, they obviously want to fight. And when they think that they have a chance of getting through the process, they want to play nice. And, regardless of how that works out, one thing that I think is clear is Altria does not have the best interest of the vaping industry as a whole in mind. They are looking out for their product, which is Juul. And Philip Morris International is looking out for IQOS, which is, to date, the only even sort of e-cigarette product that's ever made it through the regulatory process that the FDA is imposing. For people who don't know IQOS, it's what they call heat not burn tobacco. So it's a special cigarette made of real tobacco that is inserted into an electric device that heats it up without burning it. So there's a lot of good evidence that it may be a good substitute for cigarettes. It may play a similar role to e-cigarettes. I'm not trying to demonize IQOS by any means, but they are also the only product that's made it through this process. And right now, if the FDA came through and banned all flavored e-cigarettes, or went even further and banned all unapproved e-cigarettes, as people like Senator Dick Durbin want the FDA to do, that would just be handing a market monopoly to Philip Morris. They would have literally the only product on the market.
Now, you just mentioned Senator Dick Durbin. I mean,
Yeah.
he's a Democrat, and forever, right? All of the pushing on e-cigarettes has been coming from the Democratic side for the most part, right?
Yeah.
And we'll excuse Mr. Romney, who's really a rhino. He's really a progressive, right? He's a rhino. So, in the States they're called rhinos. In Canada they're actually called what they are, and that's progressive conservatives. There are parties in Canada called progressive conservatives, and then down there they just hide themselves inside the Republican Party. But anyhow, that's my disdain for that. But back to the Democrats. So the Democrats, are right behind it. And that's why the ideology just isn't an ideology of tobacco control. There is the political ideology of the left, of the progressivism that's behind this too as well. What I've said a lot is that vaping is not the open systems market. Through its growth, it's been so explosive in terms of huge, quick and fast, and all of a sudden there's this thing here, and then the people inside it are not like die-hard business people that have been running corporations for 20 years, that kind of thing,
Right.
So there's a lot of pushing and shoving and stuff like that around in the vaping community, and a lot of unplanned, uncoordinated actions and this and that. And I know that FDA, CDC, and then definitely the government have had troubles figuring out who exactly to be talking with, and when they want to talk, mostly they don't, but when they do. And I've always kind of felt that there was a calculation was made from the Democratic side, which was, we can deal with big tobacco. We've got them already under our thumb. They're already paying us the blood money, right? Like in billions, right? That's all done. So why don't we just kind of squish, the open system side, and we'll just leave a couple of the big guys standing, which are big tobacco, and they'll be happy with that because they've already brought big tobacco to heel.
Yeah, and the irony of that is, to the extent that this is truly motivated by concern for youth use, it's not the open systems that appear to be driving that. It's the closed tank systems like Juul, owned by Altria. So it's a lot of trade-offs there, where you end up rewarding some of the worst actors by the way that they're demonizing these smaller vape shops, who I think have generally been more responsible and generally been more focused on trying to help smokers quit.
Rewarding the worst actors. That's almost a RegWatch title. I like that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if we did what Dick Durbin wanted, we would be giving Philip Morris and potentially Altria, which up until recently were in merger talks and those could start again. But we could just be creating the biggest big tobacco company from scratch all over again by clearing the field of all their competitors.
Okay, so bear with me. I need you. I need you for another 20 minutes. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm here.
We might just going another 10 over here for sure, because we definitely need to get to this, and you've just taken this to our spot before we go to this other place. Okay. So describe. You told a story, and I've read it actually recently. Actually, I think it was in a Wall Street Journal piece, maybe too as well. And you briefly mentioned it. Tell our viewers about what happened with the beer industry when there's like 20,000 or 40,000 craft breweries or something like that, and then when government moved in, the thugs that they are, with their regulation, I hand it to you.
Yeah, well, prohibition was obviously the big cause of wiping out the beer industry in the United States, and then when prohibition was lifted, attitudes had changed towards beer. The way people drank it had changed. They went from pubs into their house. They went from a cask of ale to a can of beer in their refrigerator. And of course, there were tax and regulatory issues with trying to start brewing. It was illegal for starters to be a home brewer. So you had people, learning how to homebrew, but they were breaking the law when they did it. So we've got to give a tip of the hat to Jimmy Carter on this, actually, who finally legalized homebrewing, which I think was one of the main factors that set off this cascade of Americans getting to know better beer and to have this explosion of breweries that we get to enjoy today.
Beer and peanuts.
Yeah. So I do like to analogize that to cigars, especially because these regulations that were designed for big tobacco and to regulate big tobacco, the only way you can get through them is to be one of these undifferentiated cigarette brands like Marlboro or Camel or Parliaments. And, for the most part, differences between these are pretty minor. Your reason for smoking Marlboro or American Spirit or Camel might have more to do with whether you like Joe Camel or the Marlboro Man, or the organic-ish marketing of American Spirits. Whatever you identify with from a brand perspective is what you'll gravitate to. But the cigarettes themselves are all, if not identical, in the same general ballpark of what they taste like and how they're made. Whereas the cigar world, I would say, and that's a good analogy for your mass market lagers, your Coors Lights, your Budweisers, some of your European imports, which is what people thought of when they thought of American beer 20 years ago and what gave it a bad name. Whereas now the explosion of different varieties and styles is much more akin to the cigar world, where there are thousands of cigars released every year, different origins, different wrappers, different sizes, different techniques for how they age them, how they cure the tobacco. It's very just endless variety, and the FDA tried to get an estimate for how much was out there, and they struggled to even do it. But if we regulate the market the way the FDA wants to, where to bring a new cigar to the market, you've got to go through all this testing, you've got to do all these marketing studies. You basically have to convince them that releasing your new cigar is good for public health, which I don't know how you do that. You could make the argument that any new product, you're only releasing it because people might want to use it, so that's potentially bad for public health. It's not the right standard.
You can't even prove red meat is good for public health.
Right, and it's not just for the user. You don't have to just prove that, if I pick up this cigar instead of my usual cigar, I'm not hurting myself. You have to somehow extrapolate that to the entire population of the United States and say that allowing me to use this new cigar blend is not going to detriment the entire health of the population of the U.S.
Yeah,
so it's a huge burden on these small producers, and it's just going to contract the variety that's available to cigar smokers, which the FDA just dismisses as really being of any importance.
Right, and that's really comes down to one of the big things that never gets talked about at all. We try to when we can in some of our pieces. 2 years ago, we did a piece. We had Dr. Roy Spencer on, who's a NASA scientist, runs all of the satellites and everything that measure sea ice and everything else, and he's a lukewarmer on climate change.
Okay.
He firmly believes that there is no warming happening because he's the one that's running the satellite network, NASA. It's not, they don't really have the evidence for that. It's not really happening. And the piece that we did was called Dirty Tactics, How Climate Change Science Spoiled Vaping. Because the exact same things that happen in climate change happen now in vaping, and they did in the tobacco, but obviously tobacco, did actually kill you. But with climate change, it was the precautionary principle, which is what you just described, is the precautionary principle. So in the absence of scientific evidence that there is harm going to happen, but a good belief that there could be, it is then your duty to then prohibit that action. That's what the precautionary principle is. So, and it's enshrined in Canada's charter, it's enshrined in the EU's charter. The US has acknowledged it, but not enshrined it. But when you're describing that, that is the precautionary principle operating at the FDA. And you can imagine, of course, through the Obama years, it just got riven through everything, right? So, and it all comes from the original environmental movement and public health together. The environmental movement and public health together codified the precautionary principle. And, that was the whole thing, like, well, if there's, oil tankers going through a strait and, there's never been an oil spill there before, but there could very well be a good reason. So we're just going to have to ban tankers through the strait. even though there wasn't, it doesn't matter. And that's the precautionary principle. And we find that all the time in the early vaping debate. You would hear interviews with local politicians and reporters still back then asking, well, so why should we do this? I mean, shouldn't people have a right to do it? Well, we don't really know. There's not enough research yet. We really don't know what it's going to be, so we're going to have to ban it. So they say, we don't know. There is no research. Thus, we must ban. And that's the precautionary principle. The other one is ends justify the means.
Right. Yeah, I would. I think we might evaluate climate change differently between the two of us. So I'm reluctant to draw too many parallels between them.
No problem.
I claim no particular expertise in climate change, but my own view is that it seems fairly convincing. But the precautionary principle, I think, is a huge problem, especially in regard to vaping, tobacco in general, where the costs fall on individuals. Climate change. We can set aside how we evaluate the risk, but we probably agree that the risks are distributed globally. So all of our actions are affecting everybody else. Whereas with products like e-cigarettes, it's a adult making that decision for themselves and just, not imposing on others. So I think there's less of a case for intervening, even if you do think there's a risk of danger. But the thing that the Royal College of Physicians pushes back on, which I think is very sound, which is that there's also risk in inaction. And, if we suppress e-cigarettes because we think that there might be some risk down the line, we also run the risk of missing the benefits of getting smokers to switch. So there's no escaping risk. Inaction is an action, and you do have to choose. So the question is more who gets to choose. And for me, I think, especially on the issue of nicotine and tobacco, the user should make that decision, and we should try to make sure it's informed, but we shouldn't be overruling them if they decide that that's a risk they want to take.
What about the ends justify the means? I know you did mention it in your book.
Yeah, I mean, that's also a huge issue, especially with regard to the secondhand smoke science, and I think we'll probably see that with vaping too. That's still developing, so it's harder to measure. But yeah, a lot of the alarmist science about secondhand smoke, I think people are willing to overlook the flaws as long as it helped them make the case of restricting smoking. Going back to the very beginning, even Richard Kluger, he was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who wrote a great book called Ashes to Ashes on the history of the cigarette. By no means a pro-cigarette journalist, but he acknowledged that the early studies on secondhand smoke and the surgeon... Oh, there we go. Yeah. And he says right in there, I think he says Coop was going down the evidence for a noble end of making a healthier society, but using shaky science to do so. And you absolutely see that with secondhand smoke, which is not to say there's no risk. I'm not trying to say secondhand smoke is totally...
Cigarette by the author Jacob Grier, Esquire, who happens to be joining us here for our marathon little RegWatch episode. So we're wrapping it up here in about 10 minutes or so, and we're just finishing it up with a bit of a book flash. And then the next one is this one.
I have not read that one, actually, so I'm not going to be able to tell you. Maybe this is one I should have read.
There could very well be. I just raided my bookshelf on the way in here today. Yeah, it's the movement, the state, and the public's health. This is though pro-tobacco control. This is like glorified stories from the people who fought the good fight, right? That kind of thing.
I wish I'd come across it.
Yeah. And I'd have to check my Zotero to figure out to know where I got the note from. Whenever I get a tip on a book or I'm reading a tip, I put it in there. So.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Zotero saved my life, man.
Cigarettes are sublime. Yeah, that's what I talk about at the very end of the book. That's a tricky one. It's a little bit impenetrable. He's a French literature professor, but I think it's a really interesting book. It's hard to even explain where he goes with it.
Right.
But yeah, I do admire. He's trying to get at the appeal of cigarettes, and he was writing in the early '90s when the writing was on the wall for what the future of smoking was.
Yeah, there was a chunk of this. I think was in Jonah Goldberg had a book that was a conservative-oriented book with a series of essays, and I think some of his work got in that. That's how I've gotten there. Yeah.
Yeah, but he Klein himself in the book describes it as an exercise in hyperbole,
Right.
where he says he's trying to lavish praise on the cigarette, not because he really believes it, but because it's a necessary corrective to all the terrible things that have been said about it. So he lavishes praise just to prove that it's not completely abysmal.
Right. It's with the flourish of like a 60s hippie or a Jacques Kerouac or something.
Yeah. And he goes deep into a lot of literature that features cigarettes and people trying to quit smoking. It's really fantastic work, but it's very singular. It's not a objective history. It's not a factual discussion of cigarettes. It's just a very unique literary work.
Well, it's sublime, like the title says. Yeah. Right? Okay, the next one here is
Smoke in Their Eyes. So you're pulling out some ones I've not read that one either, but I'm familiar. I think I've read some of the author's papers, however.
Yeah, this is also inside, well, it says, right, lessons in movement leadership from the tobacco wars.
Yeah.
So this is all. I mean, if you want to know exactly what Matthew Myers and was thinking when he was negotiating with Big Tobacco, this is the book to read.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's some stuff in there. But, but that's the thing. One of the reasons why I'm bringing these in, it's not to test you whether or not you read them or not. It's just discussion points. But it's also one of the things that I liked about your book so much is that, it wasn't like all from this one side or that one side or too much deep in the history. It was great, right? Like it wasn't a survey book. Your book's not a survey either, right? It just, what are the things that need to get talked about for a regular person who might know a little bit about this issue or not at all, right? And so that's what makes it very good. You know what? You're a magazine columnist. You're a magazine writer.
Right. And there were certain stories I wanted to tell. Like, I wanted to tell the story. Well, I mean, the early part of the book is all about getting people out of this mindset of only associating tobacco with cigarettes. And so that whole first chapter is about all the different ways that people consume tobacco prior to the 1900s. Just to kind of shake you out of your complacency of thinking about tobacco as just the gross thing you buy at the 7-Eleven in a pack of 20. And then I use the phrase in the title, creative destruction, very deliberately. And that's an idea by economist Joseph Schumpeter describing how innovation works, with the idea that it's not necessarily just a kind of a gradual thing that's described by graphs and economics charts. It's about new technologies coming up or new ways of doing something that just consumes the previous part of the industry and replaces it with something new. So it's kind of intentionally ambiguous. It's the creative destruction of the cigarette. So it's the way the cigarette creatively destroyed everything that came before it and got rid of all these other ways of consuming tobacco. But it's also a hint at what may be coming now with vaping, because I see the electronic cigarette possibly playing that same role now, a little more than a century later, destroying the cigarette and replacing it with something new, if it's allowed to do so, which is the big open question right now.
Yeah, I mean, the regulators and the anti-smoking opponents, need to let that happen, no doubt. Okay, so real fast.
Nope, don't know that one.
Okay, yeah, you might not. Like I said, I rated my thing. This is From Pathology to Politics, Public Health in America. And this is James Bennett and Thomas DiLorenzo. And you should know DiLorenzo.
Yeah, I've heard, familiar with some of his work, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's
a pretty hardcore libertarian, yeah?
Yeah, he's hardcore libertarian, yeah, for sure. Yeah, right, for sure. Okay, so...
I'm more of a squish libertarian, but...
Okay, so we're almost there. Okay, one more on this one. The People versus Big Tobacco.
Nope, have not read that one.
Okay, I promise everybody, if you go to the back of his book, it's huge. He's got tons of resources.
There's more than 500 citations in the back of the book. I had stacks of books in my apartment. You're pulling ones out I haven't read, though.
It was unbelievable. So the fact that I've got ones that you don't know it's actually, for me, it's a bit astonishing. It means that I've got a good library. Okay, so here's now, you're not going to know this. You're not going to know this.
Yeah, you're right. I don't know that one, but I'm intrigued.
And neither any of my audience. I only ever show a few books to my audience. This is the first time we've ever done something like this.
Okay.
This is John Bascombe in The Origins of the Wisconsin Idea. Okay, what the hell is that? Well, it just only turns out to be that progressivism in the United States of America, which is where it was created, the American form, the German form, it was its own little form, but this is in 1880. It first was implemented in Wisconsin.
Okay.
And it's actually called the Wisconsin idea, implemented at the state level by the governor, John Bascom. And when you read this, you'll hear you hear the origins and genesis of the entire anti-vaping movement and the anti-smoking movement, and the whole temperance movement and everything. What do I got here? You know what? I should have done that. 1 second. Yeah, but like, so the discussion of the sense of disgust that the progressives had for smokers is like from day one, and you covered that, right? You took it all the way back to what, James the First? Is it James the First?
Yeah, King James the First was the big one. But yeah, the I don't know if you have the book Cigarette Wars by Cassandra Tate.
It's at home. Yeah, I did.
Okay, that's she's another Pacific Northwest person. I believe she's based in Seattle. At least she was when she wrote the book. But yeah, that's the really in-depth history of how the progressive movement interacted with the anti-smoking movement at the turn of the century, when there was strong opposition to cigarettes and actually bans in 15 different states on selling them. But before they really had the science to back it up. So it was, this weird mix of, like you said, it was more moralistic. It was kind of looked in disgust at this product. Mm-hmm. But, prior to the 40s and 50s, there just wasn't the science to back it up and make that into a larger movement.
Yeah, exactly. It's the cigarette. You know what? I don't have that. And when I was reading your book, who is that again? Cigarette Wars by who?
Yeah, Cassandra Tate. And it's not a super long book, but it's very, very in depth.
But she makes a progressive connection.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's one of the main figures is Lucy Gaston Page. There's also Thomas Edison, Henry Ford. And it went along at the same time with the temperance movement, which I think you could probably describe, like you said earlier, as progressive conservatives.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's exactly it. Yeah, they are the conservatives. Well, because they're religious for one, right? And people don't understand that progressives actually are social gospel, right? In their head, they don't realize that the temperance people that they have been taught and believe are these crazy right-wing religious people are actually crazy religious people on the right of progressivism.
Yeah, you would find this book fascinating because it talks about the moralistic elements of it, how people believe that cigarette smoking eventually sets you on this path to moral degeneracy and becoming a criminal. Henry Ford wrote a series of books called The Little White Slaver, the case against the Little White Slaver, which talked about how he had different celebrities write essays about how the cigarette, if you were a young person, would destroy your chances of going anywhere in life and set you on this path to crime. You talk about, sketchy social science. You would say if you look at the history of any criminal, they started as a cigarette smoker, which is probably a case of correlation, not causation. but it was good enough at the time.
Totally. Okay, we're almost there. This
All
one.
Right. Did not read that one. I'm familiar with it, and I know Jonah's writing, but never read the whole book.
Yes, really good. He does a lot about the smoking in here. He talks about our good friend Mr. H over there in old Germany, and describes that. And of course, liberal fascism fascism comes to America in a smiley face. Mm-hmm. So what does that look like? It's a partnership between progressivism, regulation, corporations used to thwart liberty. It's really good. I mean, it's a fantastic book. The thing is that it was Jonah's first big piece, right? Mm-hmm. And he really threw everything in it. The worst thing, though, is that because of Trump so discombobulated him, he won't acknowledge his old work. But he took a lot of junk for that, right? Because
I do remember. I think I was in DC when that came out.
2008, 7.
Okay, so yeah, I was right when I was leaving then. It's what drove me away. No, not really. I don't know.
This one's new, about a year old.
That is on my list, but I have not read that one.
Fantastic read. Yeah. This is a Liberal Reformers, everybody. Thomas Leonard, Race, Eugenics, and American Economics in the Progressive Era. He's a Princeton University Prof, and very, very good. Okay, we're just down to like 2 more here. So I'm gonna do hardcore one.
Okay.
You ready?
Ready. Oh, yeah. Robert Proctor, yes. Excellent historian who I have very differing views on with regard to how tobacco should be regulated.
And there's the other one from him, just so everyone's got it. The Nazi war on cancer and racial hygiene, right?
And he also
the
has
hygiene argument is really important to progressives, and you get that with this anti-smoking and anti-vaping.
And he has a newer book, I think from 2012, called Golden Holocaust. And that's the book where he lays out at extreme length his case for, he prefers the word abolition, but I think that's a bit of doublespeak. He's basically arguing for prohibition of some form of tobacco, and he seems somewhat vague on exactly what he means by that. Sometimes he seems to imply he just thinks we should prohibit cigarettes. Sometimes it's all forms of combustible tobacco. But in the book, he makes the case in a lot of detail that we should simply outlaw the sale of the cigarette. And the final chapter in my book, where we talk about the pleasure of smoking, deals with his arguments a lot, because he really buys into this notion that it's not enjoyable and that people only smoke because they're addicted. And because of that, he makes the argument that prohibition would be easy. He seems to think that most smokers want to quit, so if we prohibit smoking, we'll be doing them a favor and they will be grateful, and you won't have huge problems with black markets. I think that's wishful thinking, and I think black markets would arise right away.
Right, that's the sin of progressivism is that they believe there is no true bad part of human nature. They don't believe in human nature. So if they don't believe in human nature, they don't believe that people can do bad things, and they believe that naturally we're just all good. It just needs to squish us and contort us enough, either from a kid in brainwashing to as adults through regulation and laws and force, right? To force people to be the good person that's pure, which we all are in their minds at birth. But that's just not the case. That's why they think it must be addictive. Why would you choose to do something that's going to hurt you? Because human beings are fallible.
Yeah, and as a sign of how much he disregards smokers' interests, the one allowance he makes in the book is that you should be able to grow your own tobacco for personal use. Which, if you are someone who enjoys tobacco, that basically means what if you live in a small apartment like I do? Like I guess I could maybe grow a tobacco plant. I don't know how well suited the climate of Portland, Oregon is to growing apartment grown tobacco. Totally. Maybe if I tried really hard, I could pull it off. But am I going to make something that is comparable to the cigars I can buy from Nicaragua or Dominican Republic or Cuba if I get my hands on them? No. So that's and kind of going back to the title of my book. One thing I was very intentional about was I did not want the word nicotine in the title of the book, because I hate this very reductive view of smoking that people who don't smoke have, where they say it's only the nicotine. And so if you believe that, if you believe it's just nicotine, then you see nothing wrong with banning certain forms of tobacco and saying, oh, you need nicotine, chew some gum. You're not missing anything. And I think anybody who actually does enjoy tobacco knows that the experience is much more complex than that, and it can't be so simplified and reductive. Or if it was, quitting cigarettes would be easy. We would have solved the problem a long time ago, just by gum or patches or anything else. But as we know, the experience is much more complex than that, which is why e-cigarettes are potentially a breakthrough if they better replicate the experience of smoking without all the harm that goes along with it.
Right.
That said, about Robert Proctor, I will say, I do cite him several times throughout the book because his history of how the science of the harms of smoking was done is very good. We just reach very different conclusions about what that implies for what people should be allowed to do with their bodies.
Rightly so. Yeah, I mean, he's definitely a good read in the areas that if the niche fits properly in particular particular parts. I use them too. I said
Yeah.
it too as well. So before we do our final wrap up, I just want to point out to our viewers that regulatorwatch.com is supported by industry and viewers, and we need your help to keep our coverage going as the industry goes dark over all of these vaping lies and smears. It hurts RegWatch too. So if you could go to support.regulatorwatch.com and make a commitment to monthly would be fantastic. $5, $10, $25 makes a big difference. And we've got our hero wall of supporters going up, which is logos of all the companies and shops that support RegWatch. And then, of course, for the single contributors, we're going to put your names up too. So you'll be on the wall. So make sure you go to support.regulatorwatch.com. Try to do that this month if you can, because we really need to know if we're keeping our lights on next month. But that's just the way it always is in this business. Jacob.
Yep. As a freelance writer, I agree with that.
Yes. Well, you've done one hell of a job with your book, and let's just do that one more last plug on it. It's
right.
The Rediscovery of Tobacco, Smoking, Vaping, and the Creative Destruction of the Cigarette by Jacob Grier. You can find it on Amazon. If you go and there is no such thing as Borders anymore, is there? That's gone,
I don't
right?
think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Right now it's just Amazon, but it'll hopefully be out to more places soon.
Well, that's great. Last word for you, my friend. What can our audience expect with vaping? If you were to predict what's going to happen, is there going to be an industry that looks similar to the industry today tomorrow, or is it going to be much different?
Ooh, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. We've got some really tough days ahead, I think. My one advice would be, I talk in the book about how there's liberal harm reduction and illiberal harm reduction. And the idea of illiberal harm reduction is kind of what the FDA's approach was, which was you were going to master the market from above, kind of centrally plan what products are on, what products are off, and guide everyone away from cigarette use eventually, but under the wise leader of our technocrats, which is a very appealing vision. But I think what we've seen this summer is one bad news cycle is all it takes for everybody in charge to completely lose it and put the entire project at risk. So my advice is to always frame everything from liberal in the classical liberal sense, not the current way that's used. But the liberal idea that smokers and vapors and anyone who uses nicotine who's an adult is in control of their own bodies, and whatever we do has to come from that starting point of we can have sensible regulations, but ultimately the decision is up to the individual, and we have to respect that. And if we start throwing each other under the bus and saying, well, we just want to preserve vaping, we're going to ban the cigars, or letting us be divided that way, it's not going to turn out well. It's got to be united front, supporting adult choice.
Well, that's fantastic.
That's my takeaway.
Well, that's a good takeaway. Yeah, that's good. I'm not going to put any opinion on that. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. This is awesome. It was really good being on the show.
Oh, that's great, man. Appreciate it. Well, that's it for this edition of RegWatch. Before you head off, please again drop by support.regulatorwatch.com and commit monthly. And don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. For regulatorwatch.com, I'm Brent Stafford.